Well, that's a hard act to follow, I must say. Thank you, Tony. That was great. And thank you to the Boijmans for inviting me here, holding this symposium. And congratulations to Saskia for the most wonderful exhibition. I mean, it's great. It's a great privilege to be able to say a little bit about one of the 4 collectors who are being celebrated there. This is a corner of André Breton's studio. It's a photograph that I took shortly after he died. And I just wanted to give you a sense of what some of the surrealists themselves surrounded themselves with. Many of them were great accumulators, collectors. This is a corner of the studio showing you Giacometti's suspended ball and various other bits and pieces from all over the world. I mean, André Breton, was really a great collector, but he couldn't afford to collect just what he wanted. If you bought something, you often had to sell something else. Part of this, of course, now is at the Pompidou, known as the Breton Wall. And this is his desk. And facing him here is a Tolai ancestor figure from New Britain. In the center is the peace headdress from the Kwakwaka'wakw people, with a humanoid hawk surmounted by a raven with outspread wings. And there's an Uli figure on the left. So I think the passion was for objects that spoke to him. He had a passion for discovering and possessing all sorts of bizarre objects, surrealist objects. And he talks about hunts that unleashed an unusual hunger. There is Breton again at the 1936 exhibition in London that Roland was instrumental in setting up. And Roland was really, of the 4 collectors that you have here, he was the only surrealist, I think. It's debatable about Edward James, and in a way that's a question I would like to leave hanging over what I'm talking about, the extent to which Edward really could count himself as a surrealist. But we'll see about that. I think most serious collections of surrealism have a very distinctive character, reflecting a particular interest in or bias towards one or more aspects of this protean movement, with its inventive mediums, whose productions followed no formalist logic and could not be characterized or categorized according to the normal conventions of modern art. I mean, surrealism is intrinsically, the visual productions are extremely different. There is no such thing as a surrealist style. It's really, I think, very important to remember that. It's also the case that surrealism is best known internationally and became famous through its visual productions. So in a sense, it's identified so much with the visual that people tend to forget that it really began as a movement addressing many things: poetry, philosophy, psychology, politics. But it's the visual that somehow dominates our familiarity with it. And I think this is a sort of, you could see it as a sort of problem in some ways. Now, you've seen a reference earlier on in Tony's talk to, no, I think in Saskia's talk, to Dali dressing up in a diver's uniform to give his lecture. On the left, you can see a group at the same exhibition, 1936, in London, at the Burlington Galleries, with Dali on the far left, and next to him is Edward James. And it was Edward James who was going to translate the lecture that Dali would have given. Presumably, you couldn't have been able to hear it anyway because he was inside a dome in which he nearly suffocated. But it was Edward James who was reported in the newspapers as Dali's manager at this point, which I think is really not very accurate. So we see James in these group photographs of gatherings at the Burlington Galleries. Shortly after this exhibition, James went to visit André Breton at his studio, his home, among those wonderful objects in Paris. And he wrote to Dali, describing this visit. He said, "I've also visited Breton, whom I found surrounded by manifestos, something that must be pretty typical of him. He signed, got signed, and put into envelopes all these manifestos with the help of a gentleman friend who looked like a one-eyed beetle or black cockroach, a well-primed disciple of the movement, one of Breton's policemen, devout, working as his secretary. Some of the signatories of the manifesto had crossed out their names because they disapproved of something in the text. This had evidently been the subject of many discussions, debates in the chosen cafe, and even dramas. So you can see that James was not really constitutionally suited to belong to a movement that spent most of its time arguing about the wording of a manifesto. I mean, it's putting it a little bit cruelly, but I think that he was intrigued, he was interested, but he was not going to really become a fully fledged member of the movement. He was too independent and too little interested in polemics and the wider intellectual concerns of the movement to wish to join it. There aren't, so far as I've been able to find, very many photographs showing Edward in the middle of his collection, in the way that you always see photographs of Breton in his studio. There are some. This is one from the early 30s. I'm afraid it's not very clear. I hope you can see Edward seated at his desk in front of a really great Picasso that he owned, with the composer Markovitch on the right-hand side. And these extraordinary drapes, he's created the most sort of Baroque tent interior. It was very, very grand and very lush. This is his house in Wimpole Street in the 1930s. And I think it's sort of a crucial part of Edward's identity, thinking about identity a lot I have recently, that he was so wealthy. And it always reminds me of a passage from Henry James's book, The Wings of the Dove, about Millie Thiel, who was a wealthy heiress. And this is how he wrote about her. She couldn't dress it away, nor walk it away, nor read it away, nor think it away. She could neither smile it away in any dreamy absence, nor blow it away in a softened sigh. She couldn't have lost it if she had tried. That was what it was to be really rich. It had to be the thing you were. And I think, in a sense, Edward didn't want that. He didn't want to be identified as one of the richest people in England, but that is what he was. And he'd inherited it. So that was him from the very, very start. Here he is in front of an African object that he collected. And I think it's very important to see in the section of this exhibition, which is devoted to Roland Penrose, the ethnographic material there, because the Surrealists were among the very first to properly sort of value, as well as to collect, non-Western art and non-Western objects and non-Western sculpture. I have to say, ironically, that Edward is the only one of these four collectors that I never met. I very nearly met him when I went with Roland Penrose and David Sylvester to West Dean to try and persuade Edward to lend some of his great Surrealist paintings to the exhibition we were organising at the Hayward Gallery called Dada and Surrealism Reviewed. But David and Roland decided to leave me in the car. I was a very junior member of the team at the time, because they thought it would be better for just them to go and try and persuade Edward. So I never actually met him. So that is one of the ironies of this. So these are two of the houses that Edward owned. West Dean on the left, wonderful, generous old place as he described it. And on the right, Monkton, which he transformed as a perfectly good Lutyens house. He transformed it into a sort of surrealist place. He was a patron of many people, many artists, during the 30s, which included not only the surrealists, but also the neo-romantic artists, Chellichev, Eugene Berman, and Christian Bérard. But really, the two artists, or three artists actually, with whom he is particularly identified and with whom he had an important correspondence are Dali, Magritte, and Leonora Carrington. This painting by Magritte, I'm afraid in reproduction, you really cannot appreciate how extraordinarily finely painted it is. Do go and look closely at it in the gallery. It's called Not to be Reproduced. It's one of Magritte's masterpieces, I think. Magritte had great talent for what you might at first think is a kind of one-line joke. But you look at it more carefully and it becomes a very, very subtle and beautiful painting. But when you look at it, look at the back of Edward's jacket. Here it just looks as if it's black. But in fact, it's a very fine sort of red-flecked tweed. And you can see the paint is exactly that. So what Magritte can do, when it looks as if he's just painting a sort of rather sort of child's object lesson book picture, not at all. They're very, very careful. And the textures of the materials are extraordinarily brilliantly painted. So do have a close look at that painting. So Magritte, the correspondence between Edward and Magritte in 1937, 1938 is very close, very, very friendly. And this is a sketch on the right for the painting called The Pleasure Principle. The letter comes from 18th of May, 1937. And Magritte writes to Edward saying, "And you yourself, my friend, have you worked a little? I'm sorry I don't read English, because I think I would have much enjoyed what you do, to judge by the poem in French that you wrote." So I think Edward really hoped, in a sense, and encouraged a feeling among those he patronized, in a way, the painters, that they were equal in terms of creation, that he as a poet would be respected in the same way that he respected them as artists. There was a slight unfortunate incident with Magritte at one point, when Magritte wrote a letter to Edward saying, "Dear Edward, I find myself rather short of money at the moment. You have a great deal more than you need, and I have a lot less than I need. So could you sort of redistribute a little?" And Edward wrote back absolutely furious letter saying, "You don't seem to realize that I have to run a huge estate. I'm looking after thousands of people and thousands of acres of Sussex. And no, I cannot possibly help you." There was a little temporary froideur at that point, but they went on. This is the Pleasure Principle. And he wrote to Edward 12th of July 1939 about the painting Time Transfixed, which you can see on the right, the locomotive coming out of the fireplace. And he writes saying, "It's curious. I was thinking of you when I was painting Time Transfixed. I think the ideal place for it is at the bottom of your staircase." You can see his photograph down there at the bottom of the staircase. "So that your visitors will be stabbed, transfixed, pierced on the ground floor, and could appear in an interesting state on the first floor." So Edward was in a sense, he was engaging Magritte in the whole arrangement and decor of this house in Wimpole Street, which the decor no longer survives. So that one could say a great deal more about Magritte and Edward, but I want to go on to the other two in the time I have left, Dali and Leonora. This is a photograph of Dali with his wife, Gala, formerly married to Éluard, and Edward James on the right. And this was really a very close and very special friendship, I think, with Dali. They probably met in about 1935, and then the friendship was very, very intense for 3 or 4 years. But it didn't really quite survive the experience that Edward had of installing the Dream of Venus in the World's Fair, which we'll come on to in a moment. This is Edward in front of one of the paintings he owned, Sleep. And this is the great painting now in the Tate, because half of Edward's collection of Dali paintings went to the Tate, well, not quite half, and many more were dispersed, but a number went to the Tate, and the other lot went here to the Boijmans. So this is called the Metamorphosis of Narcissus, and it's a painting that Edward felt very close to the genesis of it. You can see a little sketch at the top here, and a letter in Dali's hand, and he's writing to him, I'm sending you immediately the general photo of the picture to amuse you in the clinic. You can look at it from every direction and lose yourself in all the geological corners. Don't tire yourself too much, and don't fall in the water like him. Of course, this is Narcissus, you know, the story of Narcissus, who was a very, very beautiful boy, and everyone fell in love with him. Everyone of all genders fell in love with him. But he only really loved himself, and he gazed at his own image in a pool of water until eventually he kind of dissolved. And of course, this is also, in a sense, is Dali trying out his paranoid critical method. But in this case, you've got the two images that in some paintings merge into one, separated. So there's the figure of Narcissus, and then this bony hand of Narcissus springing from an egg at the side of it. Edward seems to have been very instrumental in inventing the shaped frames that you see here in the pair of pictures, the couple with their heads full of clouds, and which Cecil Beaton photographed Dali and Gala looking extraordinarily glamorous and playing with these empty frames. I say empty frames, but they're not empty frames, they're landscapes, but without faces. And probably Magritte got the idea for representation of the torso from those framed canvases that Edward and Dali had devised. This painting also in the exhibition, of course, lives here anyway, The Impressions of Africa, 1938. It's another painting you really have to go and look at very close, because the double images, this is the core of the paranoid critical method, the double images where you see more than one image within one single configuration. Seeing if I can. You see, there's Dali's face, staring at the canvas. He's gazing beyond it, as if he's actually seeing something that he is then going to fix on the canvas. Coming out of his head is the head of Gala. Then Gala's eyes become the semicircular openings of a building behind there. Then as you move along, you have a whole series of increasingly tiny double images. For example, you've got a donkey's head here, and in the donkey's head is the figure of a priest with outstretched arms. So but these are quite detailed and quite tiny, so you must go and peer at that painting and appreciate it. It's a fabulous painting. It's one of, I think, over 120 paintings by Dali that Edward owned by the end of the 30s. And between them, they, exactly who invented which is unknown, but certainly Edward was responsible for the actual making, the production of a number of the objects, like the lip sofa, the champagne lamp standard, and the telephone, which were probably invented in a collaborative way between the two of them. 1939, Edward was largely responsible financially, certainly, and to an extent, actually administratively, for the Dream of Venus Pavilion in New York World's Fair. And here, it's just that you see him working with Dali and Edward. And here, again, Edward with one of the models for the Dream of Venus Pavilion. And Dali left just before the pavilion was due to open, leaving Edward to pick up all the bills and everything else. And that was the beginning of the end of the friendship, I would say. Leonora Carrington, really the third of the artists with whom he had a particularly close relationship, he met in Mexico. She had gone there. You saw her earlier on, together with Max Ernst. She found her way eventually to Mexico, married a Hungarian photographer, and was settled in Mexico City. I think, in fact, the two of them met on the beach at Acapulco. Didn't immediately take to each other, but because Edward found her rather frightening and brittle. But they met again and got on extremely well. And Edward started buying. And as with Dali and with Magritte, he was buying the work of an artist who was not yet really well known. I mean, of course, looking back, it looks as if he was buying already the most famous surrealists. It's not at all the case. He was helping people who actually were his friends and who needed, in a way, financial assistance. As you will read in one of the letters in the introduction to the exhibition. So Leonora on the right, Edward on the left, meeting in Mexico. And I think in some ways, Edward felt much more at home with the expatriate surrealist group in Mexico than he had, as it were, at the heart of surrealism with Breton in Paris. He knew Remedios Varo very well, Leonora Carrington, Perret, and Cathy Horner, all those who were involved with, in a sense, at a distance with surrealism, and who had been involved with the magazine Snob, which is a wonderful magazine, very surrealist in character, very Mexican, well worth looking at, and he was also involved in that magazine, Snob. So with Leonora, he purchased this wonderful portrait of the late Mrs. Partridge, which I think was actually a reference to the other Carrington, Dora Carrington, who had been married to Ralph Partridge. And so it was a sort of play on her own name, Leonora's own name. And she wrote to Edward saying, describing the character in this painting, she was fey, but she was county. And of course, there was a very particular kind of class game here, which the two of them understood very well, because they were both county. That means, you know, you were on the sort of top level of the social hierarchy in England, and so they had games together, making fun of the upper bourgeoisie, which is really where they both came from. He bought the house opposite, I think one of Leonora's greatest paintings, and also was in at the start of this painting. It was a painting he kind of commissioned from her. It's called The Giantess. And Leonora wrote to Edward on the 31st of August, 1946, I have started your big seascape, and I think it will be good. In any case, don't think of paying for it till it's finished, and you have some idea of what it's like. I paint with the baby in one hand and the brush in the other. I simply must do something about this damned exhibition if we're to live a bit differently from this bloody round of being shut up in Francisco Pimentel like an animal in the zoo. So Edward writes back saying, one of the few bright lights in my last few weeks was your letter telling me that you were starting on the seascape. I was delighted to hear that you were going ahead with it. I do hope the lady will be standing in a boat. Will she have birds on her dress, or little landscapes commingled with cubicles full of personages? I imagine her in a long, rather 14th century cloak, such as ladies wore at the court of the Dauphin around the time of Joan of Arc. Maybe there will be little aperçus in the folds of her cloak, containing queens of the eclipse of the moon and curious beasts conducting eclectic conversations. In fact, a dress panelled with conversation pieces. Or if she were covered from the lobe of the ear to the ankle bone with small, bright birds, that would be lovely also. So he's really getting involved in the actual planning and execution, in a sense, of the painting. In the end, the giantess has the face of the baby, as you can see. That is Leonora's baby, who dominated her life at the time, surrounded with a wonderful golden corn. And otherwise, though, the image does, in a sense, correspond to what Edward hoped it would be like. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Las Posas, which is sort of the second half of Edward's life as a great poet, patron, and creator. And what I think I will do, if you'll forgive me, is just run through the images I have of Las Posas, to try and give you an idea of what the place is like. It's about 8 hours drive north-ish of Mexico City. It's a kind of, that's the village of Xilitla, a little town on a hilltop, about 2 miles from this extraordinary sort of hidden valley with wonderful waterfalls that Edward acquired. He was on a hunt for orchids. He was also a great plantsman, Edward. He was looking for orchids in Mexico. And somebody said to him, oh, I know where there are orchids growing, in this valley near Xilitla. So they went there, and so he found this very beautiful place, but part of which was a coffee plantation, actually, at the time. And he bought it, and he began transforming it into a kind of Mexican version of an English landscape garden with ruins and follies, the sort of thing that he knew well from his childhood, places like Stowe in England. But he built, or had built rather, these extraordinary kind of concrete structures, which are both building and sculpture and flowers. This is one of them. And very often you feel it's also almost like what a child would want to do, imagining building a sort of magical playground with ladders and steps that lead nowhere or into the void. I mean, it's a complete dream of a place. This is the construction. And these very strange, they're concrete poured into wooden molds that now themselves have sort of turned back into plants, and orchids are growing from them. But here you are, you see staircases that go up and then disappear into nowhere. It's like Jack and the Beanstalk, something very dreamlike. And there's Edward enjoying the sun in his garden on one of the beams. There's more of them, the waterfalls, more of the waterfalls. And this is a pile of the wooden molds that were made to construct these things, often on a very tiny sketch of Edward's, which are now, thank you to Sharon for sending me these photographs, which are now displayed rather beautifully in a little museum in Keiller. So who was Edward? Well, in the end, I think he wanted to be remembered as a poet. And on his tombstone, here he is sort of surrounded by his garden on his own, and I find very moving his tomb, which is up in the woods above Westdean, and it simply has on it Edward James, poet, 1907 to 1984. Thank you.